material, I wanted to present a little bit of my own research and to try and make it relevant to some of the themes that we've been discussing in the course. And the two things in particular that I want to connect are the discussions that we've had about the nature of thoughts, and also the nature of what people sometimes call mind reading, or what we've been calling psicología de sentido común. So I want to do, just in time, I want to do three main things. Y tenemos handouts también. So I want to make some distinctions. This is my favorite activity, and I think it's probably the most important thing that we can do as philosophers in thinking about, particularly about experimental evidence. Experimentalists draw theoretical conclusions from data, but generally speaking, they're not very good at it. What we can bring to the table is a more subtle understanding of the different possible positions, and to make sure that the conclusions that people draw from their experiments are indeed established by them. So there are some important distinctions to be made between different types of folk psychology, or between different types of mind reading. And the first one that I want to make is between what I'm going to call minimal mind reading and substantive mind reading. And I also want to make a distinction between propositional attitude mind reading and perceptual mind reading. One of the things that we've been talking about a lot in the course is the importance of propositional attitude mind reading in understanding social coordination. This idea that we find, for example, in David Lewis, we looked at last week, that almost all human social interaction depends upon our propositional attitude psychology. And I want to say a little bit about why that's not necessarily true, that there are alternatives to propositional attitude mind reading in making sense of human coordination and social understanding. And I want to do this because it seems to me that there are reasons to think that propositional attitude mind reading is language dependent. And so it's not something that we were going to find in the animal kingdom. But as just emerged from the presentation just now, animals are not stupid. There are lots of intelligent behaviors that we can discover. The question is not, are animals intelligent, but how do we understand their intelligence? And the idea that I want to get across, one of the ideas that I want to get across, is that we can understand animals as being very psychologically intelligent without thinking that they're capable of propositional attitude mind reading. So I think that a lot of the discussion that we've already had today has been very black and white. Are animals capable of thinking? Are they not capable of thinking? Are they intelligent? Or are they not intelligent? Are they stimulus response creatures or not stimulus response creatures? It seems to me that there are many different levels of intelligence that we can take into account and use to think about animal behavior. So let me start by talking about what I want to call minimal mind reading. And this is something that we find in the animal kingdom. And I prepared this talk to give to the Center for the Study of Evolution in Leipzig, run by Michael Tomasello, who was mentioned earlier today. So I was focusing particularly on animals. But minimal mind reading we find also in humans. But it's basically forms of social coordination that involve sensitivity to the psychological states of other participants. Just sensitivity. This is a very neutral word. I want to start as neutral as possible and then make it more specific. But it's not completely, it's neutral, but it's not empty. Okay? So there are two things that we might want to distinguish it from. There are lots of examples of psychological sensitivity that don't involve social coordination. So for example, if you look at a flock of birds, you often see the emotion of fear spread through it as they all take off. What we get is an emotional contagion, psychological sensitivity, sensitivity to the psychological states of other participants. But there's no coordination. There just happens to be collective action without coordination. And there are lots of examples of social coordination without psychological sensitivity. So when I gave this talk in Leipzig, one of the researchers there gave me a very nice example of this, which I will share with you, particularly since Rodrigo has always been talking about crows. So you're obsessed with crows. Well, your dreams are just about to come true if I can make this work. So this is an example of sophisticated social coordination in crows. And it's very impressive. But the point I want to extract from it is this is social coordination that we can explain, we can understand, without thinking that it involves any psychological sensitivity. Oops.
Oh.
How do I make it work? I click on this.
Sí.
So this is pretty interesting. So what we have is a coordinated behavior, and what both crows in some sense understand is that they can't achieve their goal unless they coordinate their behaviors, unless they both pull the string at the same time. But it seems to me that the crows are not acting, in understanding what they're doing, we don't need to think that they are sensitive to each other's psychological states. There's no mind reading going on here. This is much more an example of understanding of the physical world, or what people sometimes call naive physics, or folk physics. So, it's not yet what I want to call minimal mind reading. Minimal mind reading requires both psychological sensitivity and social coordination. So I think that there are some nicer examples of minimal mind reading in some experiments also done by researchers in Leipzig actually with dogs. These were much discussed a few years ago. So what's interesting about these experiments is that an experimenter has two boxes, and there's food hidden in one of the boxes. And the aim of the dog's aim obviously is to get the food. And what the experimenter does is signal which box the food is in. And they do this with a range of different cues. So they can look at the box that's got the food in it, or they can point to the box that's got the food in it, or they can shake the box that's got some food in it. They can nod their heads towards it. All sorts of different cues. And what happens is that the dogs are very good at detecting the presence of the food. So what they're capable of is responding to different cues. And these cues all have a common cause. They're all caused by the same thing. They're caused by the experimenter's psychological state. The experimenter intends to signal the location of the reward, of the food. And the dogs are sensible to this, are sensitive to it. They can understand it. They can act in accordance with it. But what I want to say about this is also that they can do this without representing the psychological state. So what we have here is a type of social coordination. The experimenter and the dog coordinate so that the dog gets the reward. But the dog is not necessarily representing the psychological state of the experiment. The dogs are sensitive to it, but they don't have to be represented. So the notion of minimal mind reading that I want to use is quasi-operational. It's quasi-operational in the sense that, as far as the dog is concerned, it discusses only the dog's behavior. So an operational understanding of something is something that makes reference only to behavior. But this is quasi-operational because in understanding what's going on, we need to make a reference to the experimenter's psychological state, but not to the dog's representation of it. As far as the dog's concerned in minimal mind reading, we only have behavior. But what gives this behavior purpose and point is the psychology of the experiment. So here's a definition of minimal mind reading. So a creature, let's say it's an animal, it could be a human animal. A creature engages in minimal mind reading when its behavior depends systematically upon changes in the psychological states of other participants in the interaction. So this is what happens with the dog. The dog behaves in certain ways that depend upon the experimenter's psychological state. Because what the dog does is always go towards the box that the experimenter intends the dog to go to. So there's a dependence on the experimenter's psychological state.
Sorry.
Yeah.
When you say that the dog can respond to the cues that are exhibited by the investigator, you can infer that by that behavior, the dog has some sense of the intention of the investigator. Yes.
No.
Some sense.
No.
Sensitivity.
Sensitivity, maybe.
So you are talking that the dog is conscious of that his behavior is leading in that direction. This is like an automatically response to a stimulus.
Well, it's not an automatic response to a stimulus, but it's acting in a way that reflects or is sensitive to the common cause of lots of different stimuluses. But it could just be stimulus response after all. So I make a movement and you go there and you find food. I make another movement and you go there and you find food. Pretty soon you think, if I follow this guy's movements, I'm going to find food every time. Now that doesn't require representing my intentional state, but nonetheless you're sensitive to my intentional state because where I'm pointing is caused by my intentional state. So there's a common cause for those things that is in psychology. And the dog is sensitive to the commonalities at the level of behavior, but not necessarily to the psychological cause.
But maybe this can be explained by a stimulus and response way. You can say that the dog sees that each movement that you make in some way is associated with food. So he predicts that the next movement will be associated by food.
Maybe. This is not actually explaining anything. This is simply describing a behavior.
You're talking about minimal mind reading?
Yes. That's just a name that I'm using to characterize some behaviors. Behaviors that have two characteristics. The first one is that they involve social coordination, and the second is that they involve psychological sensitivity, understood in this operational way.
Yes.
So the point that I want to get across is the distinction between minimal mind reading and substantive mind reading. So substantive mind reading takes place when you have behavior that depends systematically on how a creature represents the psychological states of other participants in the interaction. Now, this is a description, and this is an explanation. There are, as Bernardo has just pointed out, there may be things that fall under this description that don't require this sort of explanation. I just find it helpful to keep those two things apart, because it's tempting whenever you see something that fits, behavior that fits this sort of bill, fits this sort of description, to interpret it in this very rich sense. And I think that we should fight against that. We should fight against that temptation. We should resist it. William.
In minimal mind reading, do you mean that the experimenters at least have a mental state?
Yes. So here I am, a third person, and I'm describing this situation.
Okay.
And I make reference to a mental state, the mental state of the experimenter. But the minimal mind reading is taking place, I'm really interested in the dog, and I'm not talking about the dog's mental states. But if I was saying that the dog was engaged in substantive mind reading, I would be talking about the dog's mental states. Because I would be saying that the dog is representing the intentions of the experiment. Okay, so this is what it looks like. Okay, so this is what... So the next thing I want to say is that substantive mind reading comes in two types. So this is already a very rich accomplishment, but we can understand it in two different ways. There are two different types of mind reading that are going on, and this is crucially important for what I want to get across. On the one hand, we have perceptual mind reading, which involves representing the perceptual states of another creature. Or we have propositional attitude mind reading, which involves representing propositional attitudes, beliefs or desires or intentions. Now, just to jump ahead a little bit, it seems to me, and it seems to other people to some other people who've studied the experimental literature on animal cognition, that all examples of animal cognition come over here. That there's no propositional attitude mind reading in the animal kingdom. So Povinelli certainly takes that view, but it's also the case that Tomasello takes that view as well. In fact, there are very few people who think that propositional attitude takes place in the mind reading, in the animal kingdom. And that was why, in the context of Bernardo's presentation earlier, I was asking him about which types of thinking were going on. What sort of representations do you need to attribute? And I had particularly in mind, do you need to attribute propositional attitude mind reading to explain the social behavior of chimpanzees, or can you do it in terms of perceptual? But anyway, both perceptual mind reading and propositional attitude mind reading are types of substantive mind reading. And substantive mind reading is a type of minimal mind reading, and minimal mind reading involves both social coordination and psychological sensitivity. The point of this diagram is that the arrows all go this way. They don't go this way. So just because you've got evidence of psychological sensitivity, you can't automatically conclude that you've got propositional attitude mind reading, for example. So the point that I want to make is that you can observe lots of behaviors, but there are many different levels of sophistication in which you can interpret. And I think these levels often get run together in discussions of experiments.